Welcome back, class. We'll continue our conversation of Chapter 6. David Hume and Immanuel Kant will be our focus. First, let's revisit the ideas of John Locke when he focused on personal identity. Recall Locke's perspective. Consciousness always accompanies thinking. The sameness of a thinking being, identity, reaches as far as the consciousness can be extended backwards to any past action or thought. So, this continual line of being able to think back to past actions or past thoughts. So, you can remember your 15-year-old self, your 15-year-old self can remember your 10-year-old self, 10-year-old self, remember your 5-year-old self, and so on. This is what he sees as personal identity. So, it has a lot to do here with memory and this continual line or chain of memories that you have about your past actions or thoughts. This is what we mean by personal identity from Locke's perspective. So, personal identity. Who am I? What makes me the same person through time? What happens to me if I am copied? What about people who have their brains chopped in half? Hard questions, even if we have all of the facts. So, identity, the idea of who we are, our personal identity, goes to many different types of varieties. The objects that we possess, our creations, our choices, our values, those things which are our practices and habits. Buddhist teachings support this idea. The belief in a permanent self is the main source of suffering if we really do have a self. And we've already talked about John Locke's basic ideas. David Hume basically has a different perspective, and that's what we'll be covering today as part of this discussion. So, who am I? Hume on the soul. Hume calls the soul the self. As he did with the notion of causation, he wants to consider whether the self is a meaningful term. So Hume considers whether we can trace the idea of self back to some impression. So basically, the question that Hume asks is the term self meaningless noise? Do we have some impression that we can trace it all the way back to represent this idea of self? As we go through his logic, we'll see that he calls that into question. So Hume's argument that the term self is meaningless. The term self is supposed to represent an idea of something that continues unchanged throughout a person's life. The idea of self is simple, not complex. Without an impression, remember, there is no idea. So there must be an impression of self. This impression must be one that resembles our idea of self. Our idea is of substance that remains throughout the course of our lives, unchanging, constant, and invariable. Well, there is no such simple impression of self. So the term self is meaningless, and we have no idea of self. So, Hume's proof that there is no simple impression of self. For my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception. When my perceptions are removed for any time, as by a sound sleep, so long as I am insensible of myself, and may truly be said not to exist, and were all my perceptions removed by death, and could neither think, nor feel, nor see, nor love, nor hate, after the dissolution of my body, I should be entirely annihilated. Nor do I conceive what is further requested to make me perfect non-entity. I know it's a really mouthful there. I'm sure I messed some words up, but basically the essence is this. So Hume simply looks at himself. He finds no impression of a simple, unchanging single substance underlying all our particular impressions. Remember, if there is an idea, but there cannot be traced back, this idea cannot trace back to an impression, then the term is meaningless. So, what Hume thinks we do find in ourselves is nothing but fleeting perceptions, ideas, sensations, feelings, and emotions. So, when Hume looks for an impression of self that remains constant and unchanging, he only finds fleeting perceptions. So, for Hume, the self is nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions which succeed each other with an inconceivable rapidity and are in perpetual flux and success and movement. The mind is a kind of theater where several perceptions successfully make their appearance, pass, repass, glide away. So basically, think of an ever-changing storm, a weather front that sometimes has these clouds, sometimes don't have those clouds, sometimes have another type of low pressure, high pressure, always changing. So what he's communicating here is this idea of a really a self that's in flux, but not the type of self that we have always imagined. This constant, unchanging thing that is us. So, human the self. So, the idea of self, like the idea of cause, is a fiction or a human construct. As a self, we are nothing but a bundle of perceptions. The mind is no single substance. The mind is like a theater. In the theater, an amazing complex play performs. The players are the perceptions. The theater is just a performance of the play. So, Descartes was wrong after all. Thought doesn't entail a thinker. So, this represents Hume's idea of self as the bundle theory. We cannot explain our survival through time by referring to a person because no person, subject of our experiences, exists. There are just bundles of mental states, experiences, tied together by the causal relation of memory, experiencing, remembering previous experiences. We call these bundles lives. So, what we have is a no self view. The Buddha was the first bundle theorist. His no self view is a type of bundle theory. People have nominal existence. We sometimes talk as if they exist, but only the parts that make them up really exist. What we believe ourselves to be. Science tells us that there is no evidence for the ego theory. There is evidence for the bundle theory. Most of us believe something like the ego theory to be true. Unfortunately, most of us hold false beliefs about who we are. Me. But does science tell us all that? So, replacing your cells case. A high-tech alien is going to replace some of your cells with identical replicas all at once. If it changes 1% of your cells, are you the same person? What if it changes 100% of your cells? Are you the same person? There are answers to these questions. So, how we are not what we believe. How could we even know if 49% or 50% or whatever replace cells is the right place for that line? How much of us needs to be changed for us not to be who we think we are? It is implausible that a few cells will make the difference in the replacing your cells case. But that is what our natural beliefs, our intuitions force us to say, that there is a number. Therefore, we should embrace the bundle theory. When applied to all the cases, the bundle theory rejects the question, what happens to you? The bundle theory can explain what happens, but it doesn't refer to persons because they really don't exist. If 50% of your cells are replaced, then 50% of that body's cells are replaced. You don't end or survive because you were never there in the first place. These cases only raise worries because we don't properly understand the nature of persons. So let's look at some other experiments that may shed some light on it. So the experiments with split brains. Remember the corpus callosum. It is the connection in the brain between the left and right hemispheres. If we sever that corpus callosum is severed, we have what is known as a split brain. The left and right hemispheres no longer communicate with each other. In addition, the left hemisphere controls the right eye and hand, speech, and right-handers. Using a partition, each hemisphere was exposed to different stimuli. Each hand responded as if though there is a separate stream of consciousness in each hemisphere. So one consciousness saw red, the other consciousness saw blue, and they don't share that information. So in essence, we have two consciousness in existence at this time. So, split brain cases and the ego theory. The ego theory says that all of the experiences in the split brain case are being had by one ego, one person, but in two streams. The ego theory is wrong because it ignores the disunity between the two streams of consciousness. You have two different events, two different realities, and the two different consciousness. The ego can't just split in two. So, split brain cases and the bundle theory. On the bundle theory, bodies normally have an awareness of having several different experiences at any one time. There is no I, an independently existing and persisting thing required for the explanation because it does not rely on there being an I, a self. In the split brain case, there are two separate states of awareness of experiences, but neither of those states is a unique, independently existing, and persisting I. They don't exist. So, while both the ego theory and the bundle theory can explain our normal awareness of experiences, only the bundle theory provides a good explanation of the split brain cases. Combined with the lack of scientific evidence for the ego theory, we should accept the bundle theory, which means that our belief in our persisting ego, self, or I is false. When someone's brain is divided, two streams of consciousness are created. Neither of the streams is the same person as the original. But this is just like ordinary survival. We are just bundles of mental states tied together by remembering what the previous experiences were like. So, with every new experience, who we are changes. Our old numerical identity dies. So, let's revisit real quickly some of the ideas of David Hume. The goal was to combine the empirical philosophy of his predecessors with principles of Newtonian science to create a science of human nature, focused on use of the inductive method of Bacon to make careful observations and then carefully generalize. Contents of the mind come from experience. It can be stimulated by either external or internal events. He distinguished between impressions and ideas. Impressions are strong and vivid perceptions. Ideas are weak perceptions, faint images, and thinking and reasoning. Simple ideas cannot be broken down further like Locke, but complex ideas are made of other ideas. Once in the mind, ideas can be rearranged in an infinite number of ways because of the imagination. For Hume, there were three laws of association: laws of resemblance, law of contiguity, law of cause and effect. Causation is not in reality, not a logical necessity, it is a psychological experience. The mind is no more than the perceptions we are having at any given moment. All humans possess the same passion or emotions. All humans differ in degree of specific emotions. The passions determine behavior. Therefore, we respond differently to situations. Both animals and humans learn to act in particular ways through experience with reward and punishment. Now, let's talk a little bit about Kant and Kant's epistemology. Immanuel Kant, born in Prussia, now part of Russia. His family was originally from Scotland, where we saw Hume was born earlier. The family immigrated to Prussia to avoid religious persecution. As was the case with many of these individuals, these philosophers had a wide range of interests. So, Kant wanted to respond to the ideas of David Hume. Given his temperament, Kant was not the sort of man who could abide Hume's suggestion that humans are emotional, not rational beings. Nor could Kant abide Hume's claim that, at best, science and philosophy are games people play to have fun rather than ways of attaining truth. Still, in a sense, Kant gave Hume credit for all he accomplished. Hume had reasoned that since it's neither a relation of ideas nor a matter of fact, the principle of universal causation is philosophically speaking bogus. Kant conceded that PUC is neither a relation of ideas nor a matter of fact. But Kant insisted, however, that this does not mean that PUC is philosophically bogus. According to Kant's analysis of perception, every perception is a twofold reality: raw sense data and the organizing and structuring of that data by the mind. Sense data in and of itself is a meaningless jumble. Sense data makes sense only after it has been organized and structured by the mind's categories. A category, a built in, hardwired capacity for the human mind by which it organizes and structures raw sense data. One may see similarity between Kant's view of perception and Aristotle's view of substance that we mentioned earlier. For Aristotle, a substance is created when a form organizes and structures inherently formless and structureless prime matter. For Kant, a perception is created when the mind's categories organizes and structure raw and meaningless sense data. So let's look at an analogy to sort of help explain this idea a little bit further. Kant's analysis of perception, an analogy. Suppose you had a massive heap of coins of different types that were all mixed up. While they remain in a heap, all mixed up, the coins really have no value. You cannot go to the store and buy something with a massive mixed up heap of coins. Before you can spend the coins, you have to sort them with a coin sorter. The coins don't really have any true value until they are sorted by the coin sorter. In this analogy, raw sense data is like the massive mixed up heap of coins. In itself, raw sense data is meaningless jumble. The coin sorter is analogous to the mind's categories. The coin sorter provides organization and structure and thereby value to the massive mixed up heap of coins. The mind's categories provide organization and structure and thereby meaning to jumbled up raw sense data. So we have areas of the brain that we've discussed previously and you've learned in other classes. For example, the occipital lobe, where we process visual information. So all that sensory data that comes in that can be tagged as being visual information, visual data, it can be sent to the occipital lobe so it can be processed so we can make use of that information and that data, make sense of that raw sense data. So how does Kant's analysis of perception show that PUC is not philosophically bogus? PUC is neither a generalization from experience, a matter of fact, nor an analytical truth, a relation of ideas, but rather a rule of setting up our world, like a rule in chess. It's not a move within the game, but one of the rules that defines the game. So too for our belief in the external or material world. Our experience alone will not tell us whether we are dreaming or not. And the idea of the material external world is not a relation of ideas. The material world, too, is one of the rules that we use to constitute our experience, namely, that we shall always interpret our experiences of sensible objects as being in space external to us and material. So the idea is that what he's looking at here is that this is one of the rules to the game that allows us this ability, for example, to sort the raw sense data. It's not part of matter of fact relation ideas. It's just something that is a rule to how we deal and how we interact with our world. So the principle of universal causation and other categories are, as it were, the laws of experience. They are not true, rather, they make empirical truth claims possible. Asking why the mind organizes raw sense data by PUC or by any other categories is exactly as silly as asking why a criminal is put in jail. The answer in both cases is the same. That's the law. A consequence of Kant's analysis of perception is that there are really two worlds, the noumenal world and the phenomenal world. The noumenal world, the world of things in themselves. This is the world from which raw sense data originates. Human beings do not live in this world and have no knowledge of it. The phenomenal world is the world of perception, the world of sense data after it has been organized and structured by the mind's categories. This is the world in which humans live and of which they have knowledge.